Smart bombs. Military, defense and national security. The Navy worried Russia's Admiral Kuznetsov aircraft carrier might sink. Key points and summary. The Russian aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov, a Soviet-era relic, has spent 8 years in dry dock and is unlikely to return to operational service. Plagued by accidents, obsolete technology, and poor maintenance, the carrier's history is riddled with failures, from its mazut-powered engines emitting black smoke to mishaps during flight operations. Please subscribe and follow. Despite massive refit expenditures, the Kuznetsov remains a symbol of inefficiency, highlighted by untrained carrier pilots and outdated aircraft. With some of its crew now fighting in Ukraine, the Kuznetsov faces an uncertain future, likely destined to rust in port as a monument to Russian naval shortcomings. The Russian aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov is a prophet icon from the Soviet Union era, aged, unreliable, and poorly maintained military hardware. It has been in dry dock for 8 years and probably will never sail again. Built during the Soviet era, it is Russia's lone aircraft carrier and has been nothing short of a disaster. The ship was in such bad shape that the Kremlin transferred some of the sailors assigned to the Kuznetsov to form a mechanized infantry battalion to fight on the ground in Ukraine. It is currently in Murmansk harbor and will probably stay there until someone with leadership skills and common sense scraps it. In 1991, an overworked and poorly maintained Kuznetsov left Murmansk harbor bound for the Syrian coast. U.S. naval forces of the 6th Fleet shadowed her, not because of her combat worthiness, but because the Americans feared she might sink. History of the Admiral Kuznetsov. Since day one, the carrier has been a harbinger of poor design, engineering, training, lousy equipment, and bad luck. The Kuznetsov is a Cold War relic, and not a particularly good one. It was launched in 1985 and was then known as the Riga. It was commissioned into the fleet in 1991. The Soviets wanted to build carriers to project power worldwide, like the United States. However, the U.S. had more than 50 years of experience. The Russians were starting from scratch, building aircraft carriers, and it showed. The ship began as the Riga, the Leonid Brezhnev, the Tbilisi followed, and the Kuznetsov. Since its commissioning, it has only gone on 7 patrols. And many of those deployments were typical of what the ship has suffered. Mainly fires and fuel spills. A smoking heat by using mazout. The Admiral Kuznetsov doesn't rely on nuclear power for the engines, but rather a sticky, tar-like substance called mazout. During the Cold War, this fuel was popular due to its thick viscosity. While older military and commercial vessels relied on mazout in the past, its use was about finished by the 1970s. The substance's numerous shortcomings have led manufacturers to use nuclear or gas turbine propulsion systems instead. But not the Kuznetsov. The fuel spews thick black smoke, making the carrier easy to find in the ocean and hindering flight operations. Before it ever set sail, the Kuznetsov was obsolete. Why don't the Russians put large gas turbines or nuclear reactors in the vessel? The Soviet Union and now Russia can't produce large naval engines. Those have always been made in Ukraine. Now, with the war still raging, the Russians aren't going to get Ukraine to sell them anything, let alone a carrier engine. The Russian Navy puts 2 tugboats out with the Kuznetsov in the event the ship broke down, which it did in 2012 and had to be towed back to Syria. When the boilers went down, which was often, the ship could only make 4 knots. That is some power projection. Carrier pilots, flight opera.